I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on AlMayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on AlMayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on AlMayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing NATO and its role in the world. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to give it its Sunday name, though you could be confused because it's oftentimes, in fact, more often than not, found way beyond the North Atlantic. I'm joined this evening, as I always am, by a distinguished audience of experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs, like me. Let me put my cards on the table. I am not the biggest fan of NATO. I never was, and it has overshadowed most of my life. Many people think, some people still believe, that NATO was formed as a response to the formation of the Warsaw Pact, the pact led by the former USSR and its allies in East and Central Europe. But in fact, NATO was founded many years before the foundation of the Warsaw Pact. In fact, the Warsaw Pact was founded as a response to the foundation of NATO. But that's not my real problem with it. A North Atlantic Treaty Organization that has fascist Brazil as an associated member, fascist Colombia as an associate member, which is fighting in Afghanistan, had forces in Iraq, is at the very least not a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The fact is, this is the armed wing of the empire, and as such, it earns the scorn of those of us who hate empire of any kind by anybody. The NATO build-up on the borders of Russia is a clear and present danger to the peace and security of the world. Imagine if the Warsaw Pact was in Ireland, or if Scotland was an independent country, was on the border between Scotland and England. Imagine if the United States had Warsaw Pact forces, missiles, nuclear missiles in Mexico and in Canada. I was going to say or in Canada, but it would be and in Canada. Would that be likely to make the peace and security of the world more likely or less likely? I'm quite clear in my answer to that. NATO is riven now with new divisions. The United States of America has always been able to count on the satrapies of Western Europe to salute when required and to follow the old man wherever he wants to go. However, now that the old man has the mind of a child, a demented child, in the form of Donald J. Trump, many of the wiser heads at the head of government in Western Europe are not so keen to follow the old man wherever he wants to go. And they are increasingly thinking of forming their own security, hence the rise of something they told us during the Brexit debate was a fantasy of ours, the European army. Now, we could have a European army and NATO, but that would seem to be a trifle, a duplication of effort and resources and command and control. And so it might be that my wish to see the end of NATO might very well be coming true, but not in the way that we expected, superseded by other military forms. I believe that NATO is far, far more of a danger to the world than it is a contribution to peace and security. After all, who exactly is NATO defending us from? Who is threatening to or remotely capable of attacking us. The main security problems in the world today come from ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of Islamist fanaticism. And NATO's on their side in Syria. NATO is actually the ally of the very real threat of international pan-Islamic terrorism in the world. Just think about that for a moment. And the people who are trying to destroy ISIS and Al-Qaeda right this day in Idlib, namely Russia, they are the ones with the NATO tanks and missiles on their border. That's my take on it. Everyone is entitled to their free word on this show, and one of our experts will give the first of those words. Mr. Otto, you are a military and security expert. What's your take on this question?
David Otto, the Director for Counterterrorism and Organized Crime for Global Risks International. Brain dead is what the French President Emmanuel Macron, refers to NATO at this point. And, there is this indication that the 70 years old and 71 years perhaps, by April of 2020 would see that NATO has actually lost, most of its fundamental principles that, came about to its foundation. Is Russia still a major threat as the Soviet Union was? Is the Cold War still there? It isn't there, but we have, as you rightly said, the Warsaw Pact, which was created after NATO was created to challenge NATO, is no longer there. So the key question here is, why are the membership of NATO still continuing to, maintain this? And that comes to 2 points, the political point and also the military point, because most of the member states, the big ones, the United States of America, they are the ones who are benefiting from the NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance. They are the ones who are reaping some of the benefits. NATO is now involved in Afghanistan, but as the four-star General David Patriots wrote, he doesn't see how NATO is going to contribute to the asymmetrical warfare that the world is facing today. So is it relevant to still have NATO? But that is all down to the members, because you and I cannot decide whether NATO is relevant or not. This is down to the members who are are contributing towards the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But my point is this: is all these big organizations, NATO, the United Nations, are they adding any value to world peace? Perhaps the answer might be yes, but this all depends again on how you view it. But for the members of NATO, they may see this as some kind of a backup, against any eventual attack, by Russia. But this is not going to happen. We know that Russia will not, attack the United States, because they are all superpowers. So maybe it's time for NATO to look back and say, we've been existing for 70 years. It's time for us to resuscitate, or just close doors and see how other organizations can take over. But my opinion is, I don't see NATO as much more relevant, and I do agree with the French president when he says NATO is brain dead.
Now, you've highlighted some of the contradictions. Let me add another. Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey is led by the Muslim Brotherhood. President Erdogan is the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in the world. Many of the NATO countries have outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. It's actually regarded as a terrorist organization by many of the members of NATO, even though Turkey is in NATO and Turkey is under the Sultan, President Erdogan. Turkey is currently invading Syria and was toe-to-toe, tank-to-tank with Russia. It triggered Article 4 of the NATO treaty and threatened to trigger Article 5, which would have made it incumbent on all members of NATO to come to the side of Turkey in a war with Russia. So we would then be in a war with Russia in support of the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in the world. Isn't that a contradiction?
Of course, it's a contradiction, but you and I know that the Islamic State, which came from Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and which also came from, the old Al-Qaeda, the old Taliban regime, as the United States would like to put it. These are all organizations that were created, by the ISIS in Pakistan, and they came about because the United States wanted, the CIA funded them, to fight against the Soviet Union at the time. So there is no clear definition, of who is actually a terrorist here, because both sides, whether the United States or NATO alliance, they continuously go to bed with this terrorist organization as it suits them.
Well, no clear definition for states, perhaps, but for the public there is.
Of course, there is.
The public know that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are terrorists, and they're wondering increasingly how come NATO is on the side of the terrorists.
Unfortunately, the members of the public have very little to do with when it comes to who defines a terrorist. These definitions are made by global organizations, including the United Nations and the big powers, and because it's all down to the United States, the great big powers. They make these decisions. So the members of the public who suffer the most have no say in who is a terrorist.
Well, yeah, it's a sorry state of affairs. Mr. Shaw, you are a veteran of military service, decades in the army, and a specialist in the intelligence and security fields. How does NATO look from where you're sitting?
I probably covered it from a different angle, my esteemed colleague there. I think NATO has a place. And the reason I say that is because, obviously, I served during the Cold War. Yes, the Warsaw Pact then disbanded. NATO, you could quite rightly say, is there a reason for NATO to exist if the Warsaw Pact has finished? However, Russia has very much become more belligerent over time. It is a threat to the West. It divides it by, obviously, holding energy supplies hostage. It's invaded Ukraine, another nation, which is not part of NATO, admittedly. But those sort of actions concern, that sort of behaviour concerns NATO. Russia has got an awful lot of troops mobilised on the border of the Baltic states, which is why NATO has
put... In Russia, you mean?
Inside Russia, inside their own border, but it wouldn't take them 20 minutes to mobilise and drive across
everyone's
the
entitled
Baltic
to
states.
Have their army in their country,
of course. And as such, the Baltic states, having been occupied by the Warsaw Pact for 60 years during the Cold War, are quite obviously concerned that Russia could just use any pretext or some of its population that have Russian passports as a pretext to invade and take them. And that is why. Because, one, it gains them access to the Kaliningrad corridor, to the Baltic Sea. A lot of the Russian actions are about access to warm seaports. A lot of their seaports are frozen, and as such, for example, they were never really going to give up the Crimea. It was always a port in a warm sea that they require. So from a strategic point of view, they're not going to want to give up that ground. I appreciate Baltic states today have got nothing in terms of strategic material apart from access to the Baltic Sea. And as such, if he uses his own population, the Russian passport carriers, that are also dual nationality, as an excuse to invade, just as Hitler did with the Czechoslovakia, Sudan Germans in the Czech Republic in 1938, then obviously he could use that to invade. Now, that would obviously trigger Article 5, but by the time the force is mobilised, it would be too late. Russia would own the Baltic states again and occupy them for another X amount of time against their wishes as a free nation. Therefore, that is why NATO puts forces into the Baltic states. It's merely a matter of deterrence. So I think personally that actually it reduces the threat of warfare with Russia, because Russia knows then that we're serious about deterring nations that are weak. Of course, he is not going to attack America. I appreciate that Putin, in a sense, is not necessarily some sort of, master plan there to invade the world and take over, as we feared during the highlight of the Cold War. But the reason the Cold War never went hot was because we deterred it. And in a sense, we said we stand shoulder to shoulder with all the other member states of NATO, where some of them do not have large forces. We ourselves, as an aggregate of NATO forces, is still smaller than the Russian forces on its own, I might add. So we just have to provide a deterrent through, in a sense, being more professional or having the edge slightly on technology and a united front against Russian aggression.
Orwell, you should be alive at this day. The way in which you actually reversed the actuality with such aplomb, I must say you're a very eloquent man, is truly breathtaking. It reminds me of the Vietnamese general who said we have to destroy this village in order to save it. It is an absurdity to suggest that you're contributing to peace by surrounding Russia with nuclear armed forces, by expanding NATO in a way that you promised Gorbachev when he agreed to let the wall come down that you would not do. You promised that you would not encroach on Russia's borders. President Reagan promised it. The United States, on behalf of all the NATO countries, promised it. But that promise has been broken. By conducting war games with nuclear missiles on the border with Russia, you're somehow making war with Russia less likely. By the President of the United States withdrawing from the INF Treaty, unilaterally tearing it up, that's making war less likely. Isn't it the case that you chaps, you NATO chaps, are keeping yourselves in a job? You're keeping an industry alive that would otherwise expire? Have your say.
Thank you. Well, first of all, when you say nuclear weapons, there are various differences of nuclear weapons. And what we're not doing, for example, is planting tactical nuclear weapons or intermediate nuclear weapons into Europe.
You have them in Poland.
And when we say there are a lot
you have
of
them in Poland.
nuclear weapons...
You have them in Poland.
Well, fair enough, but that's not the Baltic states, which is what I was referring to. No,
it's on Russia's border.
No, well, it is.
You
no,
put tactical nuclear weapons on Russia's border.
But then Russia also has nuclear weapons.
In Russia?
In Russia, yes.
It doesn't have nuclear weapons in Canada.
Poland doesn't have its own nuclear weapons, and neither do the Baltic states.
They're American.
Neither does Germany.
That's my
why
point.
America
has
is
put
putting
its
them there.
nuclear weapons
Russia has its
in
own.
Poland. Russia has not put its nuclear weapons in Canada.
No, it hasn't, because Canada is part of NATO.
Mexico, then?
Agreed. I agree. It hasn't put them in Mexico.
Wouldn't you, sir, regard any Russian placing of nuclear weapons in Mexico as a threat to the security of the United States?
Yes, absolutely.
Why not then when the boot's on the other foot?
Oh, no, absolutely. I agree with your point that it is, in a sense, can be perceived by the Russians as threatening behaviour. But the point I come back to is the Russians have a large conventional force, still larger than NATO put together. And as such, as a little bit of the theory during the Cold War was, what if the Russians decide to take Europe, or they go through the Baltic states and don't decide to stop because, in a sense, they're winning and doing well, then and it might be perceived by NATO as the only way to stop them would be to resort to nuclear weapons. And the deployment of them forward would be on the grounds that, well, you know that they're there, you know that we're serious, so we're hoping you won't bother to invade in the first place because you know our response will be robust.
I'm very grateful for your presence. Let me just pose one last question to you at this stage. The Soviet Union was an existential threat to Western capitalist society. It wished, by existential I mean, it wished to replace Western capitalist society with its own form of ideology. But Russia is a capitalist country just like us. Why are you so, if you forgive the phrase, it's a bit pejorative, but obsessed by Russia? Why not do business with Russia as we do business with every other capitalist state?
I actually agree with you in the sense of I think there are a lot of avenues for approaching and cooperating with Russia. Certainly on measures of counter-terrorism, for example, cross-Islamist threat. We can do more with Russia. And in fact, the mere fact that we have this strained relationship and we're starting to close down on each other as we did in the Cold War, increases really the fact that we should be engaging more with each other and have that openness and people visiting to understand each other as a culture and realise that there isn't all of those threats, and it's not always the perceived picture of threat that is correct that we have. Ultimately, we should be cooperating with Russia. I totally agree. What I would say is that Russia is run by an ex-KGB officer who comes from the Cold War, the same way that I do.
He's the elected president.
He's massively disappointed that the Soviet Union
dissolved. The United States was run by the former head of the CIA, President Bush.
Yep.
But because he was elected.
Yes.
Yeah?
No,
President
absolutely.
Putin is the elected president.
He is.
Russia.
No, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. All I'm saying is his attitude towards the West is concerning because he would rather, obviously, NATO went. Absolutely. But Russia has a huge standing army and has recently invaded other sovereign nations like the Ukraine example.
That's twice you've said that. Can you give me some evidence that Russia has invaded? You mean that it took back Crimea? Is that what you mean?
Not just Crimea, but it is actually
There are
got
no
Soviet
Russian
forces
No,
in
there
the
are
east.
there are no Russian forces in the east of Ukraine. And if there was, there would be no war in Ukraine.
I've been there and there are.
Well, I've been there and there aren't.
I've seen
There are
them.
Russian people.
I've got Soviet conscripts who didn't realise that at the end of their mobilisation...
Soviet conscripts?
Well, Russian,
They must
sorry.
be pretty old.
Russian conscripts, I apologise.
What a telling slip that is?
No, I tend to use
They
the two
need to
interchangeably
be
true.
hairy-arsed
Yeah, they would be old.
conscripts
You're right,
to be
they would be
Soviet
old.
conscripts.
No,
The
you're
Soviet
right, they're
Union
Russian conscripts.
Is 30 years dead, and
It is.
it often amazes me the extent to which that is not grasped. Anyway, I've interrogated you enough. Thank you very much
Not at
indeed
all.
for excellent contribution. Sir, would you like to comment?
I would just like to say that I agree with your point that there's so much. My friends have gone to Russia, and there's so much they say we have to offer in terms of knowledge and in terms of doing. I mean, we all live together, so we can always do trade in a peaceful way, and then we can always resolve our differences, like they did after the Second World War. And
Well, I'll tell you what I watched this morning. A concert in the Royal Albert Hall in 1944, given by the British government under Mr. Churchill. And you know what the banner behind the stage said, with Mr. Churchill sitting in the front row? It said, "Glory to the Red Army." We were not just allies of the Red Army. If it were not for the Red Army, we'd be conducting this conversation in German. Now, it's been marvellous, but I'll be back after the break. You're watching كلمة on AlMayadeen television with me, George Galloway, coming from London, but talking about NATO, which we've been told exists because of fear of Russia. That's why they're in Brazil and Colombia, because, of course, the Russians are there en masse. We took the camera onto the streets of London to vox pop the public. Let's take a look.
NATO is a product of the Cold War in 1949. Do you think we're in the same situation today?
Not really. Not since 1949. I mean, I don't know whether it's a better situation, but it's not. I would say it's a bit different from 1949.
So, do we need NATO?
Yes, I think we do. I think we need it to counterbalance the increasing threat from the Soviet, what is now Russia, the former Soviet Union, and the rise of dictatorship under Putin, and obviously what we've seen in Syria and Iraq and the whole of the central Middle Eastern area.
Yes, I think we do, because this way we're not falling apart.
Yes, it's to defend the allies in the West against anything that may come from outside the NATO area.
If they are coming for surveying for different countries, that's fine. If they are not coming for surveys, then that's not good for us.
America, that's supposed to be in NATO, but they want to run NATO. They want to run the whole world. All they do is to say that Russia is getting near to their borders, but the Americans are getting NATO to get near Russia's borders. So what the hell do you think Russia's going to do about it?
An alliance between countries is always good because it means peace, yeah? But in terms of NATO, NATO is defending and holding up the perspective of nuclear power. And anything that's nuclear power is always inherently bad.
Is the world safer if NATO is dissolved, or is the opposite true?
Perhaps it might not be NATO in the future, but we need an organisation with the same ethos as NATO, I believe.
I guess so. I mean, a lot of people would disagree with that, but
The opposite is true, I think.
It would be the opposite. It wouldn't be safer.
They put more money into NATO than they do into hospitals and other things.
The world would definitely be safer if there was no NATO, because they're trying to do one world order and take away culture and different perspectives of different lands. It's about connecting with the earth. It's about loving where you live. NATO and nuclear power cannot get rid of love. Even if people die, there's still love.
Doesn't matter where you're coming from, race, color or class. The basic all unity is we have creative love. Love is the way to our heart. Love could never tear I apart.
Well, mixed bag there, including a musical interlude. We're talking about NATO, whether its dissolution would make the world safer, and what its role in the world now is. Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, on the issue of when and how and why it was first formed, okay, it was, of course, as we've repeated on many occasions, supposed to be a counterweight to the USSR. But you've got to remember, okay, that the countries that predominantly formed it, because West Germany didn't join it until 1955, and then that was only then was the Warsaw Pact created. The point about it is, Russia has not done has not committed any act of even at that time had not committed any act of provocation against Britain or the United States in nearly a century since the Crimean War. Okay, Russia had not done anything to those two countries, and yet they were obviously one of the founding members of NATO. I think it's very unusual that you would forge an alliance as a counterweight to a country that had not done anything to you in over a century.
And with whom you had only a decade before been fraternal allies.
Yeah, no. And another point is that, yes, I know that the Soviet Union did arguably subjugate much of Eastern Europe. But what you've got to remember is, they had actually made, I wouldn't call it a moral justification, George, but I would call it certainly an understandable thing to do in certain cases, because Romania, don't forget, East Germany, of course, and Hungary, all, countries that were subjugated under Soviet, satellite rule.
They were all besieging Stalingrad a few years before.
And if you invade a country, murder 20 plus million of its people, what do you expect? I certainly think that Czechoslovakia and Poland, who are now part of NATO, of course, were innocent victims. There was no excuse for what the Soviets did to their countries, but it's as nothing compared to what the Nazis did to those same countries. But the point is, most of the other countries that were subjugated had committed appalling acts against the Soviet Union, as was, and I think that it is utterly ridiculous to regard the Soviet Union as the threat when they were the ones who suffered the most, and they were simply trying to ensure it never happened again. And when people say it's a force for peace and stability, well, I'm not saying that in that case there should never have been a single war. Obviously, NATO is not powerful enough to stop every single conflict on the planet, but in a lot of cases, it actually caused instances of cooperation between, well, not direct cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States, but actually the most appalling kinds of parallel collaboration, as you saw in Iraq. A country supported by both the Soviet Union and the United States simultaneously in its war with Iran. That was an appalling example of mutual support for another country by both the NATO and the Warsaw Pact, because 400,000 Iranians died. Another point is that I don't pretend to know too much about the wars in the Balkans, the breakup of Yugoslavia. I do know, though, that Yugoslavia while it was allied with the USSR, it was not aligned with the USSR. Okay, and yet NATO, after the breakup of the Yugoslavia, took full advantage of that. And while I do, to some extent, I'm not saying I agree with their involvement in that war totally, I can see that there were certainly some compelling arguments, like Milosevic's ethnic cleansing of, Bosnian Muslims. What I do think, though, is that in that case, the NATO, even after the Soviet Union broke up, took it upon itself to maybe not instigate a conflict, but, you know, get involved in a very bloody affair right on NATO's doorstep. And for that reason, I don't think, even within Europe, during the 1990s, even after the Soviet Union broke up, it was not safe. And of course, now we're seeing the conflict in eastern Ukraine because, you know, there is a risk that Ukraine could join NATO. I think it is in general, been a you know, just fermented conflict, far from resolving it. And just one last thing. Okay, I don't demand that every single treaty be completely democratic, but was there a single referendum in any of these countries that joined NATO? Was there?
No, absolutely not.
No.
And if we had one in this country, you might be surprised at the
and it's
result.
supposed to be like the upholder of democracy, but it's not in
quite.
itself democratic.
Quite. Well, Turkey was in it for decades under military dictatorship. Bolsonaro in Brazil is an associate member. The junta in Colombia are associate member. Sir.
Okay, I grew up in London in the 1980s, and I remember NATO officials coming to secondary schools giving speeches of peace through NATO. By the time I became older, it actually became war through NATO. NATO got involved in Yugoslavia as a precursor to all the other wars they got involved in.
Libya, for example. Were the Russians massing on the Libyan border? What was the justification for NATO making war on Libya?
You tell me. I mean, you know, the other major war is the one obviously in Afghanistan, where a lot of people don't talk about it.
No, quite. I mean, that's going so well, of course.
And if we look at, you know, the drug production there, the Taliban in 2001 had dropped heroin production right down to below 10,000 hectares.
They got a medal from the United Nations for their drug suppression.
Yeah, and under the American eradication program, the hectares increased to around 200.
Not just the American, my dear.
And 24,000.
It was us that was in Helmand province. Let me take this lady in the middle.
I think it's important to consider that, like everyone has mentioned, that initially while NATO was started as you know, a project to counter the rise of the USSR back in the day, pre-Cold War era. But the reason why it's continued so far as it has is because somewhere in the line, post-1990s, it became an imperialist proxy project for the US to kind of ensure their domination in global affairs. And I know that Europe is mentioned as the crux of NATO action, but you also have to consider the lethal effects of NATO in, like they've mentioned, Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. Iran, of course. And I think one of my favorite quotations every time the topic of NATO has come up is by the the first Secretary General of NATO himself, General Hastings, when he said that the creation of NATO was to ensure that the Americans were kept in, the Russians were kept out, and the Germans were kept down. And I feel like that's just the kind of thing that's continued. And now you see this kind of crisis of this existentialist crisis that's come up with NATO, where they don't really see a reason for it to exist because predominantly Turkey wants to go their own way. The US is threatened by Russian and Chinese militarization, but at the end of the day, there seems to be no real purpose for NATO to exist, especially in line of...
Don't they look for a purpose? They look for an enemy. When the Soviet Union was no longer there, they had to find another enemy. You used the word crux.
Yeah.
Europe was historically the crux, but actually most NATO wars nowadays are not anything to do with Europe. They're thousands of miles away from Europe.
And I think one important question that needs to be asked is, has there anything fruitful come out of any of these humanitarian interventions that NATO has embarked on?
Quite so.
I don't think so.
David?
I think it's important for us to also consider the fact that when NATO was created, there wasn't any exit strategy. NATO did not have, you know, a
sunset clause.
Yeah, some kind of a clause that says, you know, this is the point at which, you know, we would close our doors. So it's important to look at it from that perspective and see the reason why NATO continues to look for relevance. As you rightly mentioned, you know, they invaded Libya, which has led to the current situation we have today. NATO is in Afghanistan, which is not working well. They are planning to deploy forces to Iraq. And, you know, so there is a continuous search for a relevance of organization that was created with no exit strategy. So I think the most important thing is for member states, who are paying, their resources and contributing to this alliance to make that decision as to when is it that we should pull out of it. But that the smaller member states, the Balkan states, are quite worried, or they've been made, to worry about they are not being a member of NATO, seeing Russia as a threat. So these are all elements of geopolitics, which the media continuously pushes forward to make sure that these organizations stay relevant. But we are at the stage of the 21st century where asymmetric warfare is the order of the day. We no longer, are expecting to have the First and the Second World War that, people that we had in the days, prior to the Cold War. So I think it's important for us to look at all these dynamics and understand why this beast that is called NATO continuously exists. It has no exit plan, and it continuously looks for ways that it can survive. And that is how NATO is run, like any other organization.
Robert, how is the developing idea of a European army an existential threat to NATO? A European army, of which I'm not in favour, and we've left the European Union anyway, thank God, but at least that would be an army of a collection of democratic countries, which NATO is not. Would a European army not be preferable to NATO?
I think you have to look at it in, I wouldn't say preferable over another. What I'd say is the EU forces that can be committed to humanitarian peacekeeping operations, for example, and they are in Africa, work in some cases alongside NATO and sometimes separately or independent. They, for example, some of the missions rotate between a NATO force, a UN-led peacekeeping force, which has NATO members, and an EU force, which also has NATO members, not more dual-hatted. What I would say that if you look at it, UN peacekeeping forces coming from across the globe, 197 nations, NATO forces that also do peacekeeping tours, and EU tours, they're all in a sense a tool in a box. So where one needs to have a break, let's say the UN can't do everything and doesn't have the money, the funding or so on, then in a sense NATO forces can go in, and the idea is to provide stability to that country and try and grow the economy and make things better to try and prevent the onset of terrorism. And the EU also do that. I wouldn't say necessarily they're a direct competitor. They are an associate of.
I think Macron thinks that, don't
well,
you?
I think I can understand Macron's sentiment when he says, NATO is brain dead. One of the things I saw, certainly working within NATO, is it's very difficult for any one country. I know we all like to say, America runs NATO. The reality is they are paying the most money. So in a sense, they have a big voice, absolutely. They have a lot of weight to throw around. But do not believe for one moment that America gets all of its own way with NATO. There has to be all those signatures on every document that it produces. And they do not all agree. There is always a clause or a caveat or something else that delineates from the main effort, you might say. I think people's fear of the EU, and certainly Britain's fear of the EU, is the EU army, is that, again, yes, it would detract from resources. We're all small armies. And like I said, aggregately, we're all still smaller than Russia in that sense. But let's get off Russia for a second. I think that they're worried about it, counteracting resources for it. And then again, you've got two separate chains of command. In a sense, NATO is already inefficient in terms of trying to get one single decision done on anything. In the same way that the same issue happens at the UN. There's so many countries, they've all got to have their say. It doesn't necessarily make for a speedy response to anything or one singular purpose or objective. And therefore things get diluted. And I think that's the worry with the EU. The EU has been very useful in the sense of taking over some of the missions in peacekeeping missions in Africa and funding projects there. So they are another tool in the box. But I think equally, there is a fear that they just take away resources and they're not required. And it would be very much European-centric. I'll be frank with you, maybe one way of looking at it from a sort of NATO point of view would be, well, if you had the EU army and you dissolved NATO, would it replace it? No. And the reason I say that, because we come back to that point, is the Americans by far have the larger force, or the largest part of NATO, in the same way that Russia is also a large superpower. So ultimately, an EU army would not be able to stand up and invoke Article 5 and stop them being invaded by somebody else. The only way they can do that is with American assistance.
Yeah, I mean, I could have a long debate with you about if the Soviet Union did not invade Western Europe when it was a communist threat to the existence of Western Europe's way of life, why would Russia, a capitalist country, invade Western Europe? But I was taken by your thrice reference to Africa. We have a number of people in the audience of African origin. I'm just wondering why you think it's a good idea for the European colonial powers to now be sending their soldiers back to Africa.
Only in terms of providing peace and stability to allow the training of a national force to to basically provide that
The basis of
security
the
within
empire
own
for
country.
200 years, wasn't it? We'll hold their hand until they're it's not worked, has it?
Oh, no, I agree. The missions have been going on far longer than they should have been. And as you said, doesn't seem to be a sunset clause in there for us to actually walk out. And that is obviously a huge funding issue for the constituent parts
Call
of
me
the
a
UN.
cynic, Robert,
They're
but
funding it.
If I was an African, I'd think you were up to something else rather than concerned with my peace and stability. I'd think you were there to nick our stuff like you did for a couple of centuries.
At the end of the day, we've sent forces in. They don't bring anything out. All they do is spend money training the local nationals, to take over their own security. It's not really that empire image. I appreciate people there that remember the old British Empire, etc. Might well see that as a concern. I would totally understand that point of view because they lived through it and they saw the old British Empire. What I'd say is there as part of a UN peacekeeping mission or an EU mandate, they are there at the invitation of that country.
Well, that
They're there
country's
at the
government.
permission of that country.
Mali, for example, has invited France, but the government of Mali is an extremely contested term. You get an undemocratic tyrant inviting white European armies to come and stabilize their power in an African country. Let's hear from Madam.
My name is Fatima. I don't believe that NATO or any Western country has real interest in Africa's stability, honestly. And I think if they did, you could use the image or the structure that you have in your own countries as a system, and you could help effectively those countries. And I don't think that's what's happening today. And I would say the word is invasion. What France is doing again and bringing up the military again to African countries after we have discussed what's happening today with the coin in Western Africa. And that all happened all of a sudden.
France is reoccupying Africa.
Exactly.
Imposing its currency
and there's
its
no help
form
whatsoever
of government and
when
its
it comes
choice
to
of politicians.
Exactly. So I don't
Britain
see,
would if it could. But the French
I
are
don't
ahead.
see NATO having a real interest in helping an African country and even to rebuild a military force. I don't think that's the idea, and I don't believe it. That's my opinion.
Madam.
Sorry, George, let me just add this because when you speak of Africa, I think as somebody who has been to most of these African countries and being an African myself, I have seen the activities. You said France has recolonized. I don't think France ever left Africa in the first place. France has continuously been in Africa at the detriment of the weak African governments that somehow have been coerced by the assimilation system of governance of the French, and that continuously has an impact in the Luptako-Goma region, which is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Today, where you see there is a concoction of terrorist organizations that some of them have left the now defunct Islamic State and have crossed over to the same Libya that has been destabilized as a result of French intervention, and now are residing, within the Sahel and causing all sorts of havoc within the region. The European Union is there, the United Nations is there. These organizations do not understand the cultural dynamics of these African governments in terms of how to bring instability. They want to transfer this form of, democratic system of governance in a system that is fairly, new and doesn't really need an immediate or revolutionary change in terms of their governance system. So I think it's important for us to understand that all this idea of NATO helping Africa or the EU helping Africa, they're not helping. They are there specifically for their own interests. Go to Central African Republic, where I've been. You would see the chaos that is, is being caused in that region. Go to Somalia, for example. The same thing is there. Go to Nigeria, in the northeastern Nigeria. Boko Haram has, multiplied to the Islamic State of West Africa province. They are still there. But, the United Nations, the United States, Britain, and all these superpowers talk about we're assisting these countries. Yet, the level of violence keeps increasing as the day goes. This region is now the most dangerous region. But, the resources that are there, where are they going? Most of these resources have been taken from the back door. So, Africa needs to really wake up. And that is where I call for the African Union, to take its position. But it can't do that because the African Union itself depends on, the United Nations, depends on countries like China for, for its resources. And this is the same, evil, circle which is going on within this region. But hopefully, I think, if Africa gets, its business, intact, which I doubt it will, maybe between the next 50 years, then we would see some kind of progress. But right now, Africa is under a headlock, of the Western nations.
Madam, we can't leave the discussion without talking about Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. This has arguably, I know not in terms of quantum, far more people have died in Iraq, for example. More than 1 million people have died as a result of the absolutely illegal UK-US invasion and occupation. But in geostrategic terms and in terms of the length of time which it has gone on, this must be the biggest military disaster that NATO has ever been involved in. After 18 years and hundreds of thousands of deaths, some thousands of them British and American deaths, all that blood has been spilt for precisely nothing. The Taliban will be back in power in Kabul 5 minutes after the withdrawal of the Western forces. The heroin issue that you referred to, multiplying and cascading around the world, poisoning the veins of our young people all over the world. Yet no lesson appears to have been learned from it. As someone of that kind of Eastern background, would you agree with me that Afghanistan itself is probably the worst thing that NATO has ever done?
If you speak to any Afghani on the street, if you were to go to Kabul and you were to speak to anyone, and if you were to ask them who the real, I wouldn't use the word enemy, but they would. Because in conversations, the word would definitely come up. They would not look towards the Taliban as the real perpetrators of the 18 years of violence that they've experienced, but they would always tend to point towards Western forces that they think came into their country, were unable to understand their cultures, the way they worked, were unable to speak the language, were unable to connect with the people on the ground. In that regard, a lot of them tend to see Taliban as the saviors, and I would not blame them when they do so. The Taliban were able to understand the economic value of even, like the gentleman mentioned, the narcotics trade. NATO forces were unable to understand, the US and the UK-led forces were unable to understand that was a very legitimate economic means for a lot of the Afghanistan population back in the 2000s. When you decide to airbomb the poppy cultivation without any regard for what the people are going to tend to in terms of how they're going to eat, how they're going to survive, you turn out to be a bigger perpetrator, bigger aggressor than the Taliban, who were able to provide a legitimate sense of leadership in many parts of Afghanistan. So there's a very, very deep sense of resentment when it comes to people from the South Asian region about NATO forces just coming into their country, deciding to stay there for 18 years. And even when they leave now, it doesn't really make much of a difference. When the Taliban say that they've declared a victory, 100% it's a victory. What has the US, what has the UK, what have the NATO forces really managed to achieve after close to 2 decades? and spending millions and millions of dollars, in this so-called war on terror.
Well, this has lasted twice as long
Yeah.
as the First World War and the Second World War
Yeah.
put together. And not an inch of progress has been made. An ocean of blood has been shed. To me, that kind of sums NATO up. It's one of the many reasons why my conclusion from this debate, I reached it before we started, but with all respect to the participants, nothing changed my mind. No to NATO. That's where I stand. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a terrific show. I hope you all enjoyed it. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة on AlMayadeen.